Good afternoon, everyone. It is Sunday, January the 17th, 2021. It is currently 3:38 p.m. Central Time. I'm coming to you live from Victory Baptist Church, located here in Ovalo, Texas. And we're going to spend some time this afternoon, focusing on theology. I mean, in that, wow, what's new? It's Theology Central. No, it's going to be an afternoon of theology. I hope this goes well. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be reviewing a discussion about a very important concept in the theological world. I don't really know how much this controversy, this debate, has really impacted the average person sitting in the pew, but I think the average person sitting in the pew needs to be aware of this controversy, of this debate, just so that they can be protected in case a different perspective is offered to them. They at least know what it is, maybe some background, and know where it came from and some different ideas. I don't know exactly where this discussion is going to go. Here's what happened. I just saw this a few minutes ago. I'm like, oh, a discussion about this. Okay. All right. I know what I'll do. We'll just spend some time listening to it together and talking about it. What I'm going to try to do, here's my goal. We're going to listen to this discussion. I don't know which direction it's going to go. I don't know where it's going to go, which always makes me a little nervous, but it adds to that feeling that we're just sitting down together to listen to this and have a discussion. But it will at least, what I'm going to try to do, my goal is to take this theological topic that may not seem relevant to the average person sitting in the pew and try to find some principles and some ideas to say, see, right there. That's important to you. Here's the principle to remember. And so that's what I'm going to try to do. And I'm going to try to make this discussion about a theological concept that maybe you're aware of or not aware of, and try to make it relevant. And I'm going to do my very best. What we're going to be talking about today, for this next little while, this Sunday afternoon, where we're going to spend some time talking about theology, we're going to look at the new perspective on Paul. The new perspective on Paul, sometimes I think referred to as the new perspectivism on Paul, and we're going to discuss this. Now, here at Victory Baptist Church, I have discussed this, kind of given the basic teachings of this concept a few times, so I think my people are pretty knowledgeable of it, but one, it won't hurt them for this review, and two, it definitely won't hurt to get this discussion out there for people who may have never, are not really familiar with this, don't know what to really think about it, or they've heard discussions about it, but they don't know if they really got it. I'm going to try to make it all make sense, I hope. But a lot of this, the quality of this is going to be really based on the quality of the discussion we're about to review. I know the smart person would have reviewed it first, but why review it first when I could just review it with you, and we'll just have fun. All right. So get something to drink, open up a Bible, get a notebook, and let's listen to a discussion about the new perspective on Paul. This comes to us from the White Horse Inn, which is a podcast I would recommend subscribing to. And they're going to discuss this, and we're going to see what we can learn, what we need to be warned about. And we're just going to see where this goes. So are you ready? A Sunday afternoon discussion on the new perspective of Paul, a Sunday afternoon of theological thinking and theological study. I hope you're prepared. I hope this will be beneficial, and hopefully it will provide some perspective, and no pun intended. Hopefully I will offer my own unique perspective on the new perspective on Paul. What is the new perspective on Paul? Do we need a new perspective? What was wrong with the old perspective? Was the old perspective incorrect? How do we understand this? Well, let's jump in and let's see what we can get from this. And hopefully this will be beneficial, and you'll want to share it with someone else. So are you ready? This podcast episode that we're about to listen to from the White Horse Inn, I think aired just about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. So it's relatively new. In many ways, people in the theological world, I felt, kind of moved away from discussing the new perspective on Paul. But here we have a discussion, so let's see what they have to say and if they add any new information to this. Here we go.
What's happened with many of the proponents of the new perspective is they have assumed if you are in a covenant with God, it must be conditioned upon grace and these kinds of things. Tom Wright says to be justified is to be in the covenant. So I argue throughout Israel's history, Israel is in the covenant and unjustified by the terms of the covenant throughout almost all of her history. We miss what Paul saw was a fundamental difference in kind between the Abrahamic covenant, for instance, and the Sinai covenant.
5 centuries ago, in taverns and public houses across Europe, the masses would gather for discussion and debate over the latest ideas sweeping the land. From one such meeting place, a small Cambridge inn called the White Horse, the Reformation came to the English-speaking world. Carrying on the tradition, welcome to the White Horse Inn.
Hey there, and welcome to another episode of the White Horse Inn. I'm Shane Rosenthal, and joining me once again is T. David Gordon, who is professor of religion and Greek at Grove City College in Pennsylvania, and the author of Why Johnny Can't Preach and Why Johnny Can't Sing Hymns. Last week we had Dr. Gordon on the program to discuss the topic of media ecology, since he teaches a class on that subject, and this week we'll be talking with him about his book, Promise, Law, Faith, Covenant Historical Reasoning in Galatians. So, T. David Gordon, first of all, Happy New Year to you, and thanks again for being my guest on the White Horse Inn.
Good to see you, Shane. Nice to be with you.
So before we get started on today's topic, I'd like to revisit one of the themes we addressed last week related to the fact that our culture over the past half century or so has increasingly moved away from the reading and expositing of texts to what seems to be a preoccupation with images, whether in the form of television, movies, or throughout the platform of social media. What, in your opinion, are some of the dangerous side effects of that cultural shift, particularly for 21st century Christians?
Yeah, well, when Moses brought the tablets down from the mountain, one of the prohibitions was against making any images and not to bow down to them or serve them in any particular way. And so at the very beginning of Mosaic religion, Yahweh prohibits the use of images and instead gives us a canon filled with 66 books that are all language and not a single image, and he prohibits the use of image. So undoubtedly, God has indicated an enormous and extraordinary bias towards language. So it's a very big issue when the dominant cultural medium shifts from language to image roughly in the mid-20th century.
Now, that's an interesting discussion. I know it's not the topic. They want to talk about the new perspective on Paul, but let me frame this kind of just introductory comments that they just made. Let me frame it in a way that hopefully will be challenging to you. In what way do you believe this shift to communicating by images, or images being a dominant means of communicating, how do you feel this shift in culture has impacted your church and you when it comes to studying Scripture, reading Scripture, and interpreting Scripture? Do you see that it's played it's shown itself in a negative way within your church or within your own life, that you're so preoccupied with images that when it comes to sitting down with a Bible and a notebook and doing serious work with the written word, do you believe it's hindered you in any way, shape, or form? In what ways has it hindered you? What ways has it hindered maybe the preaching of the church or the hearing of the preaching of the church? These are things you really need to examine yourself, because I cannot necessarily say this is how it's impacted you, but there's been such a dramatic shift within the culture away from the written word that I think when I preach, trying to teach and expound the written word, do people hear it differently? Do they interpret it differently without the use of images? I use no images. I hate PowerPoint slides. I'm opposed to using PowerPoint slides. So I use no images. I just preach the text. Now, the image that people have is hopefully an open Bible in front of them. That's the image, and that's really the written word. So because my job is to say, here's the text. Let's work on the text. Let's ask questions about this text. Let's try to figure out this text. Let's struggle with this text. Let's look at all the different interpretations of this text. Which one could be right? This one could be right. This one could be wrong. We did that this morning with Romans chapter 8. Here's 4 contrasts. Are these contrasts about a Christian and a non-Christian, or is this about a saved person for a saved person and a carnal Christian, between a Christian and a carnal Christian? I guess that's the right way to put it. Yeah, I'm doing so good with the spoken word, aren't I? But so I just think it's something that we have to ask ourselves. How has the shift to kind of a visual means of communicating, dominating our culture, how has that impacted Christians and the church? Only you can answer that. But it is interesting that God seems to put his bias towards language, towards the written word versus images. It is something that we could have a lengthy discussion about, but let's see where they go.
Conclusion of last week's program, I asked you to give a summary of your new book, Promise, Law, Faith, and when you finished, I cheekily replied that it sounded like it wouldn't make a good TV show. So I guess the challenge for contemporary Christians is that if we are amusing ourselves to death by just swimming in a sea of images and sound bites, if we're amusing ourselves to death for the better part of the week, we could ask the question whether or not we'll have the intellectual fortitude required for reading and correctly handling the word of truth on Sunday mornings.
Yeah, I think that's right. I told my students on Wednesday's Greek class, there's a prayer in Ephesians 1 at verse 15 that runs through 23 as a single sentence. It's one sentence with 19 verbs. The King James was able to translate it in a single English sentence. ESV was 2, NIV is 5, the Message is 8, the NIV Reader's Version is 22.
Wow.
So what they're actually doing in most cases is they are realizing the average adult now reads like a child, and children aren't really capable of deeply subordinated rich sentences. But yeah, we've reached the point now where even our English Bibles are basically written in a child's syntax rather than an adult syntax.
You know, Peter says something to this effect in one of his epistles where he admits that many of the things that Paul writes are hard to understand and that the simple distort and twist them to their own destruction. So I think what it assumes is that we should be training people in our congregations to be able to handle some of those difficult things.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Notice how he was concerned about the wicked and the unstable, that they would twist these as the other scriptures to their own destruction. He was already aware that the easiest people to manipulate are the simple.
Yeah.
You see, because they're unstable. They haven't firm enough, well-grounded opinions. And nowadays, with the onslaught of so many media, our people are in many ways far more unstable because what they believe on very superficial reasons. They saw a video, they saw an image somewhere, they saw a 5-minute YouTube clip or something like this. They have very, very weakly grounded, I would say. So even when they believe a thing that's true in itself, it is not a very well-established or well-substantiated truth. It's a very simply established truth.
Well, so let's dive into some of the deep issues that you explore in your book, Promise, Law, Faith. First of all, before we discuss your unique approach to Paul's letter to the Galatians, you talk a lot in your book about the new perspective on Paul. And for those in our audience who might not be familiar with this debate, can you introduce this view and who are the major advocates of the new perspective and what are they saying about Paul?
Well, the expression was coined by James D.G. Dunn when he gave a public lecture that was later published in 1983 called The New Perspective on Paul. And as he said in that essay, it's really a new perspective on first century Palestinian Judaism. And so Dunn was actually acknowledging the influence of the 1975 book by E.P. Sanders, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, in which he argued from the reliably dated sources that there really isn't any convincing evidence that the Judaism of the period taught people that they could be justified before God by their own personal obedience. Atonement is not the religion of the self-achieving, it's the religion of the self-insufficient, whose sins must be atoned for by someone. And the frequent appeal to the mercy of God is once again not the language of the achiever, it's the language of the person who can recognize his inability to achieve. So we used to say that when Paul spoke negatively of the law, he obviously must have been referring to the teaching that you could justify yourself by obedience to it. And then Sanders really questioned that paradigm. And so Dunn says, this gives a new perspective on Paul then, one that did not assume that his negative comments were due to what we might call legalism or meritoriousness.
So now you've described your own view as a kind of middle ground position between the views of the new perspective and the dominant Protestant way of interpreting Paul. And one of the ways I think this will be helpful for our listeners is to have you walk us through your interpretation of Galatians 2:15 and 16, where according to the ESV, Paul says, quote, "We ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners, yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ." So can you talk about what Paul is saying there and why you think there are problems with the way that that is translated.
Yeah, the structure of the Greek is that the verb know is actually not an independent verb at all. It's a participle. So King James translated, we who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ, even we have believed in Jesus Christ, and so forth. He doesn't say we who are Jews by nature and not Christians,
Yeah.
right, or something like that, or we who are Christians by nature and not Gentile polytheists. It's Jews vis-a-vis Gentiles.
Yeah.
So whatever the knowing consists of that he's talking about, he attributes to being born and reared as an Israelite, as a Jew. That is to say, who knows what the crazy sinners of the Gentiles think? You know, I can't speak for all of them. He might be saying something like that. But we who are Jews by nature, reared under the covenant God made with the descendants of Abraham at Sinai, we surely know that the law always condemned us and never justified us.
And you also have argued that Paul may be alluding to Psalm 143, verse 2. What's the point you're making there?
The point there is, to ESV's credit, by the way, ESV has a footnote that refers to Psalm 143, verse 2. And so they think that Paul is quoting here a portion of Psalm 143, and that's because that particular passage, the psalmist actually requests that God not enter a judgment with him because he says, for we know that no flesh is justified in your sight. And so it's not quite word for word in the Greek Old Testament as what Paul does, but it's so close that many people think he is alluding to Psalm 143, verse 2 in verse 16.
So basically what you're saying is that Sanders and Dunn may have a point that Second Temple Judaism did not believe that we were justified by our works.
That's correct. And so my point was, whatever we discover historically about Second Temple Judaism, Paul argues as though they did not believe that a person was justified by observing the law. And so there could have been some pocket of Jewish heretics out there that Paul didn't know about who did teach that that was the case. And if we're understanding Paul, we have to say that the Paul that we're interpreting did not think that Jews of his day thought they were justified by observing the law, but rather that what distinguished them from Gentiles is that they knew perfectly well that no flesh was justified in God's sight. So that's what the new perspective is originally. But now 40 years later, of course, you know, a number of other people, notably, of course, Tom Wright and others have written within a sort of a new perspective, many of which I have fairly serious reservations about.
James Dunn has written that, quote, God's justification is an acknowledgement that someone is in the covenant. And similarly, N.T. Wright, who you just mentioned, has similarly argued that, quote, justification is not a matter of how someone enters the community of the true people of God, but of how you tell who belongs to that community. You've responded to this by saying that, quote, Israel was united covenantally to God by the Sinai covenant, but it was routinely condemned and almost never justified by the prophets who were the executors of that covenant. Can you go into that a little?
Yeah, my point is they've confused categories. What's happened with many of the proponents of the new perspective is they have assumed that if you are in a covenant with God, it must be conditioned upon grace and these kinds of things. There's a tendency to take the 6 or 7 covenants that appear in the Old Testament canon and put them all in a Waring blender and to sort of emulsify it so that we miss what Paul saw was a fundamental difference in kind between the Abrahamic covenant, for instance, and the Sinai covenant. And so Tom Wright says to be justified is to be in the covenant, and to be in the covenant is to be justified. So he equates the two. So I argue throughout Israel's history, she was in fact in covenant with Yahweh, and that's why the prophets condemned her. So they constantly remembered the second giving of the law in the last chapters of Deuteronomy towards the end of Moses' life, when he says, behold, I hold before you today life and death, blessing and cursing, life if you obey and cursing if you disobey. And then when the prophets came in judgment, they came to the covenant people. They were still in covenant, and they were receiving the curses for violating the covenant. And since they violated the stipulations of the covenant, they received the curses of the covenant. So I think, unfortunately, that Professor Wright has utterly misunderstood the matter when he says that to be justified is to be in covenant, and to be in the covenant is to be justified. Israel is in the covenant and unjustified by the terms of the covenant throughout almost all of her history.
Some have summarized the difference between the new perspective and the traditional Protestant perspective by saying the issue really is ecclesiology, not soteriology. Basically, who's in the church versus who is saved, who is justified. Can you unpack that, particularly as it relates to Galatians?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an understandable thing to observe. It's not the exact language I would do, but I do think that because the covenant that God made with the Israelites segregated them from the Gentiles, then there was a sense in which for the entire time that covenant was in place, God could not fulfill the promise he made through Abraham that through you and through your seed, I will bless all the nations of the world.
Yeah.
And of course, as you know, in the original, all the nations could be translated to all the Gentiles of the world. It's the same in both Hebrew and Greek. It's the same term. And so God's ultimate purpose was, of course, to reverse the curse of the first Adam all the way across the race. All of the second Adam's race would be as broad as the first Adam's. And yet for a tiny little brief period of time, he had a special covenant made at Sinai with the Israelites that actually segregated them from the Gentiles and made the Gentiles, as Paul put it, strangers to the covenants of promise, right?
Yeah.
Now in the new covenant, the promises to Abraham have come, and Jesus, the seed of Abraham, has brought blessings to all the nations of the world and not just to the Israelites, people from every tongue, tribe, and nation, and so forth.
Part of the issue surrounds the way we define the word covenant itself, doesn't it? In one of his books, N.T. Wright defines covenant this way. Here we have it, God's single plan through Abraham and his family to bless the whole world. This is what I have meant by the word covenant when I've used it as a shorthand in writing about Paul. The covenant, in my shorthand, he says, is not something other than God's determination to deal with evil once and for all, and so to put the whole creation and humankind with it right at last. What do you think about that way of understanding the word covenant?
Yeah, it's a very unfortunate way of understanding the word covenant. If he had said the message of the Hebrew Bible is God's plan through a descendant of Abraham to bless all the nations of the world, that would be a good description of God's plan. It is not a good description of any particular covenant, because the beginning of that plan is in the Abrahamic covenant, which envisions the blessings to the Gentiles. But then at Sinai, you have very rigid restrictions segregating the Israelites from the Gentiles. And so covenant is never merely a mental plan, God's plan to do something. It's actually a publicly instituted arrangement or treaty, in this case between Yahweh and the Israelites, prior to that, Yahweh and Abraham.
Instituted in space and time.
Instituted in space and time. It's not an intellectual idea that's pretemporal in some sense.
Yeah.
It is actually instituted in space and time with public ratification.
Okay, there's a lot there to unpack, and they're moving quickly. So hopefully some of these concepts may be okay. Some of these, maybe you're aware of some of these concepts. Maybe some of these concepts you've never heard of. At least you're hearing the language, so there's still benefit there. Let me do this. It really comes down to then, how do we understand? It sounds like the primary focus here is on two really concepts. I think two concepts are really trying to be spoken of here. And again, I tend to really break things down, repeat, which drives some people crazy. But I think sometimes a discussion like this is moving so fast that I don't know if the average person is picking it all up. So the first real major issue is, how do we understand the Jews? When we talk about justification by grace alone through faith alone, do we understand this as a concept that the Jews did not understand? The Jews understood kind of a works-based system, and Paul came along and was like, no, you're saved by grace alone through faith alone. Or is Paul saying, no, the Jews, as Jews, we understood this. We understood that it's by grace alone through faith alone because, well, we had the sacrificial system and we had this. How do we understand that? Do we give a correct understanding of the Jews, or have we given them a incorrect understanding of the Jews? The main thing to realize is whatever the Jews thought or didn't think, ultimately, it's making sure that we understand that clearly Paul is articulating, whether he's saying this is what the Jews already believed or not. the main thing is to understand Paul was clearly articulating that no one would be justified by the works of the law, and that we're not justified by what we do. We are justified by what Christ accomplished. Do we sometimes in preaching and teaching say this is what the Jews thought and that's not a clear, fair representation? Well, any clarification on that is always helpful. Whether the Jews believed it or didn't believe it becomes a secondary question unless that we use that in our teaching and we're not doing so in an accurate way. I think that's important. So, all right. It appears, and again, some of those passages, the one that they quoted in Galatians, depending on how you translate that, seems to kind of say, hey, as Jews, we understood this. It's the Gentiles who didn't get it. So did that mean that there was a time that Christians misunderstood what the Jews believed? There's a possibility. We always need clarification. That's why we always continue to learn, and you always want people out there doing study and research. The next big issue is on covenant. How do we understand the covenant? What was the covenant designed for? Now, this is a major issue within Christianity. You've got you could talk about things from a covenantal theological perspective, which basically says there was a covenant of works. That covenant was established in the garden. That covenant was violated. Then God established a covenant of grace, and all the other covenants that we read in the Bible were just different administrations of the covenant of grace. Whether it was Abrahamic, the Sinai covenant, it doesn't matter. They were all simply administrations of the covenant of grace. I have a problem with covenantal theology from the perspective that when I read the new covenant, it seems to make it very clear that this is a new covenant, not like the ones established with your fathers before, that it's something new, it's something different. Well, then there would have to be then that's drawing a distinction between that covenant and the other covenants. So you can't just have a covenant of works and a covenant of grace. This becomes a problem. And then you see how the different ways of trying to describe the covenant and how do we understand this? Israel was in covenant with God, but were they justified? So then there's just all kinds of issues we could get into a discussion there. It almost leads into a discussion you can get into this big discussion between covenantal theology and, say, a dispensational approach. And those are two drastically different approaches. And how do you even understand the new covenant? These are all questions which we will be addressing in different ways. Some of this will be addressed in the VBC Bible Institute. We may do some things here for Theology Central. We spent a long time at Victory Baptist Church working through these issues. We spent almost a year working through these issues about the covenant. How do we understand the covenant, the new covenant? Who was the new covenant actually made with? How do we understand this concept of spiritual Israel? We spent, a lot of hours doing some very tedious work as a church to try to draw some biblical conclusions. And so some of those issues will be brought back up over time. But we'll see where else they go with this. But those are kind of the two big issues is how do we understand the Jews? And how do we understand the term covenant? All right. And so you can keep that in mind. All right. Let's continue and see where else they go here.
This episode of The White Horse Inn is brought to you in part by Knox Theological Seminary. Now more than ever, the world needs confident leaders in every community, church, and context. Be prepared for the challenges of tomorrow by studying at Knox Theological Seminary. Knox offers a high-quality academic education in the tradition of the Reformation for men and women that's accessible, flexible, and affordable. Discover today a fully online degree program that's right for you. Visit knoxseminary.edu/whitehorseinn. Again, that's knoxseminary.edu/whitehorseinn. Did you know that you can help support the work of the White Horse Inn every time you purchase something at Amazon.com by using Amazon Smile? At no additional charge to you, Amazon will donate a small percentage of every transaction to the White Horse Inn when you link your account to Amazon Smile. Simply visit smile.amazon.com and enter Whitehorse Inc. That's Whitehorse INC. Then the next time you shop at smile.amazon.com, you'll be helping to support our work here at the White Horse Inn. Again, simply head to smile.amazon.com and enter Whitehorse Inc. Thanks for your support. Welcome back to the White Horse Inn. I'm Shane Rosenthal, and I'm talking with T. David Gordon about the new perspective on Paul. Many New Perspective advocates talk about the fact that we're invited into the covenant by grace, but that we stay in the covenant by faithfulness and good works. What's wrong with that position in your view?
Yeah, I think that what happens is it overlooks the other gifts and benefits of Christ's saving work. So perseverance of the saints, we all believe that that's taught, but we also believe that it's a gospel grace. It's an evangelical grace. This is the work of the Holy Spirit that causes us to persevere. We believe that sanctification, growth in our obedience is essential to our salvation. And we also believe it's an evangelical grace. It's a grace of the Holy Spirit. So I wouldn't want to say that God does the one by electing us into his community and we do the other. It's the same God that elects who also effectively calls, who regenerates, and who continually sanctifies, who causes us to persevere and so forth. So on that point, I think the New Perspective borrowed too much from E.P. Sanders and got a slightly errant understanding of soteriology.
Yeah, it becomes a big problem with soteriology when you believe the way you stay in the covenant is because of your works. Yeah, that's a big issue. Hey, you're brought into the covenant by grace, but the way you remain in the covenant is because of your faithfulness and your works and your obedience. Yeah, that is a problem. And no, I am kept because of the finished work of Christ. Look, if I'm saved by the work of Christ, and that involves the imputation of his righteousness, his obedience, his passive and active obedience to my account, then my standing before God will always be based off that and not based off my faithfulness and my obedience. I am faithful and I am obedient in Christ. I'm perfectly faithful, perfectly obedient, perfectly holy, and perfectly forgiven in Christ. So that's what my security is based off of, not what I do. It will end up right back into almost a Roman Catholic works-based system.
When people like N.T. Wright define justification along the lines of faithfulness, would you argue that that's a tragic mistake?
Yeah, I think so. If you think of Adam, the Adamic administration, whatever we call the Adamic covenant, the covenant of works, covenant of life, however we define it, it plainly was not, if you believe something, you will live. It was, you may freely eat of all these trees and of their fruit, but you may not eat of this one, and the day that you do, you will die. It was a real test, not what Adam would believe, but what Adam would do. And what he failed to do, he failed to do. And so that's why when Paul compares and contrasts the two Adams in Romans 5, it's through the one man's disobedience and the other man's obedience. It's not through the one man's faith and the other's lack of faith that what God originally required of the human was a full-scale, active obedience to what God created the human to be and do. And Adam failed to do that. And faith alone would not have been a work that satisfied God's demand for obedient behavior. So the righteousness of God, according to Wright, is God's faithfulness to his covenant pledges. And in the book, I looked at 829 Jewish passages that antedated Paul to see if there was any passage where the righteousness of God clearly conveyed the idea of his fidelity to a covenant, and I could not find a single one. Righteousness of God plainly meant moral uprightness. And the reason I could determine it that way, Shane, is because think of the antonyms. The wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion. Well, that's not the unfaithful versus the faithful. It's those who are morally wicked.
Furthermore, it's often contrasted. Justification is often contrasted with condemnation, not corruption.
Exactly. When it is a court's declaration of your behavior, the opposite of justification is condemnation. And so even the so-called forensic use in the courtroom is merely when some official adjudicatory body declares that you're either innocent or guilty.
Right.
And it's still a moratorium on your behavior, that it's either upright or it isn't. And so I don't believe that the notion of righteousness of God in the Bible, it all conveys faithfulness to a covenant.
You write that, quote, Jews and Gentiles were not separated merely because they were ethnic or geopolitical competitors or strangers. Xenophobia was not the entire problem at all. They were separated by the terms of the Mosaic administration itself, not by the ethnic or geopolitical suspicions or hatreds. It was Yahweh who insisted on the Israelites being separate. This is a point you argue throughout your book, that the Sinai, in a very real sense, ended up putting a hold on the complete fulfillment of everything that was promised to Abraham. According to the Abrahamic covenant, all the nations of the world would be blessed. And yet, according to the Sinai covenant, the people of Israel were for a time to remain separate from their surrounding nations. In fact, not only were they prohibited from eating or intermarrying with the Gentiles, but they were also called to destroy them in a kind of holy war.
Yeah, that's right. They were. Yeah, the interesting thing I've run into is because in our own cultural moment, the 20th and 21st centuries, we have regarded segregation along ethnic grounds as a horrible thing. Many people just can't imagine that God would have segregated his people from other nations, but he plainly did. Israel, whenever she got close to the Gentiles, actually wanted to intermarry with them and end up following their deities. And it was God, through his prophets, who had to make them remain separate. Mm-hmm. The Israelites went native every time they had a chance. Whenever they got, all the way through to King Solomon. When they got near the Gentiles, they wanted to marry them. When they came back from the Babylonian captivity, first thing they did is they took foreign wives. And then Ezra and Nehemiah said they had to put away their wives and their children. So the Israelites were not, as far as we can tell, xenophobic. The Israelites loved the nations around them and wanted to
right.
intermarry with them and wanted to have children with them. And it was Yahweh and his prophets that told them they couldn't do it. And I have to say, I'm frankly shocked that there are people who've read the Old Testament and have never noticed that Yahweh required the Israelites to come apart from them and be separate from them.
Yeah.
I don't know how they missed that.
Yeah.
But they did.
What do you think is the purpose behind that?
Well, I think the purpose is to preserve the memory of what God pledged to Abraham and the vehicle through which he would do it. Because remember, he pledges to Abraham, through you and through your seed, I will bless all the nations of the world. Now, if Abraham had started intermarrying, or if he had given Sarah as part of the harem to the Egyptians, which he did twice, then before long, no one would be telling the stories of Father Abraham,
right.
and the whole human race would lose any memory of the promise. And of course, it would destroy the Abrahamic lineage. Now, we may wonder why God wanted to bless the world through a seed of Abraham, but there's no doubt that both in the Old Testament and the first book of the New Testament, the genealogy of Jesus is traced back to Abraham, right?
Right.
So apparently it was a very important part of God's purpose to bless the entire world through a particular genealogical descendant of Abraham. And if they had intermarried, you see, there would have been no seed of Abraham left, nor any memory of any special pledge that was made to the seed of Abraham. So that's why God required them to remain separate, so that he could fulfill his pledge to bless the world through a descendant of Abraham, whom Paul in Galatians 3 identifies as Christ.
Yeah, let's talk about Galatians 3 for a bit. You have argued that chapter 3, verse 15 and following is the key to interpreting the entire book. Can you walk us through that section and explain what you mean?
Yeah, I think that the reason that it's key is in verse 17, this is what I'm saying, right? Which means he's saying a second or third time what he had said earlier. And so what he then says is this, here's what I'm saying. The law, which came 430 years afterwards, cannot de-ratify a covenant previously ratified by God so as to destroy its promise. Now, everyone has always realized that that's a reference to Exodus 12:37, because in Exodus 12:37, it says, and there were 430 years from the time the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt until they were released under Moses, right?
Right.
So everyone has recognized that the law that comes 430 years later in Galatians 3:17 is the Mosaic covenant made at Sinai. But it's called the law, right?
Yeah.
It's called the law. But it refers to a covenant, and it uses covenantal language. De-ratify, previously ratified, both covenantal language also. So everyone has recognized that when Paul uses the word law in Galatians 3:17, he means the law covenant. What's interesting, however, is prior to me, almost no one has attempted to read the book as though his earlier uses of the word law and subsequent uses of the word law also meant this Sinai covenant. All I'm suggesting is if you look at the logical connectors, if you read the book as though that's what he means, then you end up saying, now we know why that covenant has to go, because it was a Gentile excluding covenant.
Yeah, and talk also about the temporal indicators, the untils, now, before, all that.
Yeah, if you're reading the reasoning throughout Galatians 3, that's the really important thing when he says, we are no longer under the paidagogos, under the guardian or something like that. You know, Calvin thought that being under the paidago was the law as our instructor because it taught us about prophet, priest, and king. And then Luther thought that the paidago, the guardian, was our taskmaster. The law's demanding demands that we would fail and it would drive us to Christ. But to understand Paul, you have to understand why he said no longer, right?
Yeah.
Because we're still under the law insofar as its prophets, priests, and kings anticipated Christ. We're still under the law in the sense the law still functions to show us how morally imperfect we are. The one sense in which we're not under that law is as a covenant in its entirety, and especially one that excludes the Gentiles from those blessings. So all the way through the reasoning of chapter 3 and 4, the language is temporal, or as I call it, covenant historical. Before faith came, we were under the law. Now that faith has come, we are no longer under the law. When the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, and so forth. So he sees the law as a temporary thing, and so he's not referring to its eternal qualities, but to its temporal qualities, that it is a temporary provision to segregate Israel's descendants from the descendants of the nations around them.
After reflecting on your arguments for some time, it occurred to me that there are a couple of places in the Gospels where you also find that temporal language. For example, in Luke 16:16, Jesus says, "The law and the prophets were until John."
Yes.
Even the famous passage in the Sermon on the Mount in which Jesus says, "Do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And then he goes on to say that not a jot or a tittle will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Would you agree that this is basically what Paul is getting at when he says in chapter 4 that Christ was born under the law in order to redeem those under the law, that essentially he came not only to bear our penalty, but also to fulfill all righteousness?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, by the time Christ came, you see, the Sinai covenant had been the covenant that carried along Abraham's descendants, right?
Yeah.
For 430 years afterwards, And so to function with Abraham's community, within his community, and to serve Abraham's God required you for a period of time to be part of Moses' community.
Yeah.
Right? They were the Abrahamic community on earth in that sense. So yeah, he came into the earth within that covenant, submitted to all of that it required so that he could fill it. But his fulfillment is, of course, as prophetic fulfillment normally is also a termination.
Yeah.
When I fulfill my mortgage payment at some point in the next couple of years, and I'll send my last payment to the bank, I've done no harm to the covenant. I've done exactly what the banker has asked me to do for the last 20-some years, and I've sent my monthly payments in. But when I fulfill that responsibility, I don't do it anymore.
Yeah, Paul makes a similar argument in Romans 7 about the marriage covenant. If you
Yes.
if you promise to be faithful to your spouse as long as the both of you shall live, and one of them
Right.
dies, you're no longer bound by that covenant, and you are free to marry another.
That's right. And he even uses the word law there to refer to it. So he is talking about the Mosaic covenant there, that a time comes when the people of God who had known God through that one covenant, now they are free, he says, to belong to another who is Christ.
And that shows that we're not talking about antinomianism here. We are under the law of Christ, which is language you find elsewhere in Paul.
Yes. And he uses that ironic language to love one another and thus fulfill the law of Christ. Doesn't say the law of Moses, but the law of Christ.
Let's get back to the dominant Protestant interpretation. A lot of Protestants have attempted to say that the law was abrogated only in a certain sense, that is the judicial and the ceremonial, but that the moral law remains. What's your take of that typical Protestant response?
It's not the way the New Testament presents itself. It's not the way the apostles presented themselves, but it's a fairly good way of getting there. For Paul, when he says, before faith came, we were under the law, and when we are no longer under the law, he didn't think of the law as divisible into categories. It was the law in its entirety that we were once under as the Jewish people and that we are no longer under. But what we find is Paul commends and commands the saints in the New Testament many times using the very language of the Mosaic laws themselves. Romans 13 contains several. You shall not murder, shall not steal, and so forth, honor father and mother. And so it's also plain that the apostles do think that covenant God made with the Israelites at Sinai through Moses had an enormous amount of moral wisdom in it.
Yeah.
When they were thinking of it as a covenant, they realized it was gone. When they were thinking of the enormous moral truth that came out of it, they were able to rescue that. So where we end up when we have the distinction of moral, civil, and ceremonial works pretty well. It's just our attempt to try to figure how could the apostles who say we're no longer under the law also say that you should love your neighbor as yourself, for instance.
So there are places in Paul's writing where he will talk about, for example, one of the civil uses of the law has to do with not muzzling an ox.
Correct.
While it's treading the grain. And he quotes that, and he applies it to things Christian. So it seems like, however you take it, there is still some kind of an application for wisdom of the ceremonial part. So what do you think about a text like that?
Yeah, I think that's a good example of what I mean. In other words, what Paul did think is there was always the possibility in revealed religion that the God that you were dealing with would reveal something that's simply morally true, right?
Right.
And so in this case, he's actually talking about paying ministers, and he says, if you do worthwhile labor, you ought to be compensated. And he cites Deuteronomy, don't muzzle the ox when it's treading out the grain. And so he sees a kernel of wisdom in there, right? Mm-hmm. That even the animals, right, ought to be regarded as providing a valuable service, and they should be compensated so they can live and do a good thing. So I think it's more that Paul just saw wisdom in the thing and commended it because it's wise, right? I don't think he did it because he thought necessarily it was still obligatory as a law. The way a stipulation of a covenant is a stipulation of a covenant. I think he saw moral wisdom in it. So my hermeneutic here would be that the moral civil ceremonial hermeneutic that the Protestant churches have almost always used. What I'm saying is they didn't quite go far enough with it. There's no reason to distinguish the Sinai covenant and even the Decalogue from that moral civil ceremonial discussion. Mm-hmm. That is to say, it's the center of that covenant. And so there's no reason, if you have a hermeneutic that'll work for that covenant, that it wouldn't work for the Decalogue also.
Yeah.
So many others apply it to everything but the Decalogue,
right.
And I apply it to everything including the Decalogue. So I see the Decalogue not as the center of God's moral will, but as the center of the covenant. And so it influences everything, and it is subject to all of the hermeneutics that you apply to the rest of the covenant, which means for me, I have no problem in saying portions of the Decalogue are ceremonial.
Well, folks, be sure to join us again next time at the White Horse Inn as I continue my conversation with T. David Gordon as we discuss issues related to his book, Promise, Law, Faith. That's next time at the White Horse Inn. Thanks for being with us.
Okay, so what can we do with all of this? There's a lot of discussion there. You may have found it interesting. You may not have found it interesting. I hope you did. Here's what I would say. There is, whether you understand this or not, there is a major divide within the Christian world and how we understand the covenants, our relationship to the covenants. And obviously he's talking about a discussion about our relationship to the law. We're not under the law, so what aspect of the law? How do we understand that? I won't say there's as much a division. I don't think there's as much of a division within Christianity in regards to that question. I think there may be a lot of confusion within the minds of the average person. The average person sitting in the pew may not have really ever thought about these issues. But let's deal with the covenant issue first. When you start throwing out the covenants, there you have to figure out, okay, so do you go with the idea that there was a covenant of works, then there was a covenant of grace, and every covenant you read is just an administration of the covenant of grace? Even in the new covenant, it's just a covenant of grace, okay? Do you go with that perspective, or do you believe, wait a minute, these were different covenants that served different purposes at different times, and then you had the new covenant, and the new covenant was made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, and as Gentiles, we get to participate in this covenant because Israel has been set aside for a period of time, and that will be brought back, more from a dispensational perspective. Now, the way you view these covenants become very, very important because some believe, okay, you have basically this new covenant, this covenant of grace, and now for the Christian, the covenant of grace, you want to put that sign of the covenant of grace on people, and you do so by baptism because baptism is the sign of this new covenant, as circumcision was for the old covenant. Again, now, this is where it gets really weird in covenantal theology, or it's a sign of one of the administrations of the covenant of grace, I guess. Again, we can get into a whole discussion here. But how does that work? Well, obviously, my perspective is, wait a minute. We enter into the covenant, the quote-unquote new covenant, however you want to define these terminology, you can fight about it. But I think the best way to understand this is, from my perspective, no, I become a part of the covenant by faith. Just simply making me a part of the quote unquote covenant community through putting water on a baby and now saying, hey, this is a member of the covenant community, to me is just carrying on with what Israel did. They had a covenant, people were a part of that covenant, and clearly they were rebellious, unregenerate. Is that the way it's supposed to work in the New Testament as well? Or is the new covenant supposed to be superior to that, better than that, different than that? So my thing is, if you want to be a part of the covenant community, you have to be born again. You have to be regenerated. Just putting the sign of the covenant on you, and then you have to get into, did baptism replace circumcision as the sign of the covenant? And is that sign to be put on an unregenerate person, or is that sign to be put on someone who has believed and not? These gets into major questions about covenantal theology, dispensational theology, and how we try to understand this. So there is this ongoing, I think that this is a good way to put it. How do you, as a New Testament Christian, how do you relate to these old covenants? And if we understand the law as being a covenant, right? And that old law, that the law of Sinai was a covenant, and it's been completely done away with. Well, then that deals with our relationship not only to that covenant, but to the law. So we have this relationship to, how do we relate to these covenants? What aspects are we connected to them, not connected to them? What aspects of them transfer over? Like, did circumcision transfer over to baptism? And now we baptize babies, right? This comes into big questions here. But then it's our understanding of the law. I think there's sometimes within theology we can try to look at, we can almost get lost because we try to look at every blade of grass to figure everything out. And sometimes we can just make things more complicated and more difficult. And then the average person's like, what are you talking about? So let's do it this way. What is your relationship as a New Testament Christian to the covenants in the Old Testament? Now, you can argue to group them all together as just one covenant of grace and their different administrations, or you can see them as different covenants with different perspectives. I think there's a lot of ways we could discuss that. And then what is your relationship to the law? When we're no longer under the law, in what way are we no longer under the law? Are we just, the law is completely gone, and now we're under the law of Christ, and we only look for that which focuses on the law of Christ? Here's the thing I would think. I think the New Testament makes it very clear that we're no longer under the law, in the sense that if we're in Christ, we're no longer under the law, because the law no longer condemns us. We're no longer in bondage to that law because we've been set free in Christ Jesus, because he's fulfilled the law for us. He kept the law. He paid the penalty for us breaking the law, and we're now set free from the law. Now, if you make an argument that the whole Sinai covenant of law has been completely done away with, because clearly it's segregated Israel from the Gentiles, and clearly we're not segregated anymore, so that's completely done away with, well, then that could raise questions. That could be very helpful, especially when you're arguing with people who want to try to enforce Sabbath rules or dietary rules. You could say all those have been done away with. I think you can establish that even without really working out what happened to, the covenant of law being done away with. What part still is applicable? Here's the thing. Clearly, he says he didn't like this distinction. Clearly, the civil laws were for Israel, and how Israel operated under a theocracy/monarchy, a theocratic monarchy, however you want to describe it. Clearly, those would not be applicable to us. Clearly, they weren't even applicable to Israel in the New Testament, because they weren't able to carry out those laws because they were under other governmental agencies and authorities, and they couldn't do things without that government doing it for them or allowing them to do so. So clearly the civil law, you can see the doing away of the civil law, even in reading the New Testament and what Israel could and could not do. I think that's obvious. Ceremonial law, well, clearly the ceremonial law goes away because Judaism could not fulfill the ceremonial law with the destruction of the temple, the destruction of the priesthood, all gone. So there goes the ceremonial law. So that's complete. And you would say, obviously, with the death of Christ as being the ultimate sacrifice, then there goes away the whole sacrificial system. So you can see those two go away right there in history, in the pages of history, 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. So the moral law, is the moral law still applicable? I will say this. The moral law is still applicable in this sense. It still shows us God's standard of morality. And we can learn from that. But we're not under the moral law for salvation because, again, the moral law was fulfilled in Christ. So in that sense, that law was done away with. So here's the thing to try to take from all of that. As people try to argue about this new perspective on Paul and how do we understand the Jews, understand this. There's no question that Paul draws a distinction between being saved by grace and being saved by the works of the law. Whether you want to say the Jews believed that or didn't believe that, you can have that argument. We can frame the discussion that way. We are not saved by the works of the law. We're saved by grace through faith because the works were never designed to save us, and all they do is condemn us. That is clearly articulated in Scripture. All right? Then what is our relationship to the covenants? Which covenants? Which part of those covenants are transferable over? Okay, circumcision transfers to baptism. Baptism, we baptize babies, male and female. At 8 days old, boom, they become a part of the covenant community, even though they're not regenerate, even though they're not saved, and then they'll get saved later on. So then their baptism really is not a picture of their salvation. Baptism is simply a picture of them being made part of the covenant. Right, but they're not really, they're part of a covenant, but they're not saved. So now you can have members of the new covenant not saved. Like, this raises all kinds of problematic issues, but these all come into play here. And then our relationship with the law. How do we understand what part of the law? And that's where I think a lot of Christians get confused, because as soon as they want to make an argument about something, they'll just grab anything from the Old Testament and say, here's the law. You're like, whoa, wait a minute. What are you doing? I think we can argue that a major portion of the moral law is repeated in the New Testament. In many cases, though, not just repeated in some aspects. In other words, the same ideas are repeated, but you also have to note a change in some aspects of it, because whatever you have in the Old Testament, well, again, some of that's civil law. So yeah, that doesn't, yeah. I still think the distinction between ceremonial, civil, and moral, I still think is a relevant distinction. I think just saying it was all law, and it was all part of the law of Sinai, and that covenant is gone. That covenant's been removed. That covenant is no more. And so we don't have to worry about any aspects of that anymore other than what is repeated in the New Testament. That may make it simpler, but I think it makes it simpler, but it still gives people that almost leads to kind of an idea where you just throw out the Old Testament. Now, I know that's what he was saying, because he's saying there's still kernels of wisdom, but I think it's different to say, here's the moral and civil, so we got to be very careful with what we do there, but here's a moral principle, and we can see that moral principle repeated in the New Testament. So these are big issues. Their discussion wasn't great. I really wish they would have broken it down a little bit more. When I'm sitting there listening, I was like, okay, well, so what's your ultimate thesis here? What's your ultimate thesis of this episode, other than just kind of have a I don't know. I mean, how did you feel about their discussion? Did you feel it was like it just felt like, okay, yeah, what about this and what about this and what about that? But I didn't feel like there was an overall, what's the message you really want to get across in this episode? What message can I take from that? What I can say is this is what I will tell you. We have currently, in fact, let me pull it up. And the Theology Central Book Club, let me do this, because we've talked about this a number of times, and we'll probably use this at some point to get to this book and to get to this discussion. Let me find it here really quick. If you go to the Theology Central Book Club, you go to the suggested books, and let me find it here. Got to find it. I'm going to hit view all. All right, here they all are. Where is it? I know I have it here listed somewhere. Oh, there it is. Okay. It is called Discontinuity to Continuity a survey of dispensational and covenant theologies. Discontinuity to Continuity, a survey of dispensational and covenantal theologies. It's listed under the suggested books. It's $9 for the Kindle, $18 for the paperback. I would recommend getting it at least and looking at it because it breaks down. In fact, I'll just read a description here. What is the best framework for reading the Bible? The question of how to relate the Old and New Testaments is as old as the Bible itself. And you think about a lot of what we just heard was a lot of discussion about how do we in the New Testament mindset understand the covenants and the law. All right. So the question is how to relate the Old and New Testaments is as old as the Bible itself. While most Protestants are unified on the foundations, there are major disagreements on particular issues. Who should be baptized? Is the Christian obligated to obey the law of Moses? Does the church supplant Israel? Who are the proper recipients of God's promises to Israel? In Discontinuity to Continuity, Benjamin Merkel brings light to the debates between dispensational and covenantal theological systems. Merkel identifies how Christians have attempted to relate the Testaments, placing viewpoints along a spectrum of discontinuity to continuity. Each system's concerns are sympathetically summarized and critically evaluated. Through his careful exposition of these frameworks, Merkel helps the reader understand the key issues in the debate, providing more light than heat. Merkel's book will help all readers better appreciate other perspectives and articulate their own. Discontinuity to Continuity, a survey of dispensational and covenantal theologies. That is a subject that I think really is at the heart of this. Right? So if you think about what they discussed, and again, I like to break things down, and I really was hoping they would give us more. They didn't really go anywhere. It's kind of like, hey, it's almost like, hey, do you want to talk about your book? Okay, come on, and I'll ask you some questions about the book. Like, I don't think there was a real, what was their goal? What did they want to accomplish there? That's kind of a little frustrating, a little bit. I'm really frustrated because I was hoping it was going to be better. So now I've got to do their work for them. So here's what we can take from it. Number one, how do we understand the Jews of the basically the Old Testament or maybe of the temple era? Did they believe in a salvation by works? Many claim they did. They're claiming that no, the Jews did not think that way, that they actually were the ones who understood that they were not saved by works. It was Gentiles who thought that way. All right? If that is true, how do we implement that in our teaching and our understanding of the New Testament? All right, that's important. Number two, how do we understand the covenants? All right, do we understand a covenant of works, one covenant of grace, and that's it? How do we understand those covenants? Do we understand individual covenants? Do we see a covenant of Sinai, very different from the covenant of the Abrahamic covenant, very different from the new covenant? If that's true, that to me, in my estimation, from my viewpoint, they're not just different administrations, they're completely different kinds of covenants. And I've said before, how do you make the covenant of Sinai a part of the covenant of grace as administration of the covenant of grace? I don't see that. I don't see that in any way, shape, or form. I think there was like, no, you do this or you die. You do this or you die. You do this or you die. I don't see that as being an administration of the covenant of grace. So I see that as a separate covenant. And that covenant of Sinai, if we call it a covenant, that an agreement, whatever you want to say, that law is ultimately we're no longer under that law if we are in Christ. We're set free from that. We're set free from its condemnation because that's the main thing that law did was condemn. I think that's the only way I can understand that. But how do we understand the covenants? And especially that comes into play with who should be baptized. It comes into play even with Israel. Like, think about this. When you think about Israel, God made covenant promises to Israel. Now, can we come along, because this is kind of what happens in covenantal theology, what happens in some forms of eschatology, you come along and say, okay, Israel, you messed up. You violated the covenant. Well, or the covenant, or they'll say this, those covenants were never made with the nation of Israel. They were made with spiritual Israel. And spiritual Israel is the church. So now we get the promises, but the curses were for, I guess, national Israel. It's this real weird thing that, hey, Israel as a nation, you're done, and we get all the promises, but you get all the curses. Well, wait a minute. If did God fulfill all of those promises? And how come in the new covenant in Jeremiah, there still seems to be land promises made? Well, wait, is the new covenant with the church or is it with Israel and we just participate in it? These are big questions about covenants. All right? And then, so we got our relationship to the covenants and a relationship to the law. So really we have how do we understand the Old Testament Jew or even the Jews of the temple era, okay? Second temple era, however you want to identify them. How do we understand the covenants and how do we understand our relationship to law? Those are really three aspects. And I've had people ask questions about our relationship to the law. So we may have to come back to that. But I was hoping that they would really, I thought they were going to break into a little bit more like look at this aspect of new perspectivism. Here's my interpretation. But he did offer a little bit of that. I just felt that there wasn't really a specific goal in mind. But there you have it. Theological discussion on a Sunday afternoon. If you have questions about any of this or you don't quite understand any of this, ask whatever you don't understand, because then maybe I can turn on the microphone at another time and we can really dig in and do this I think we can do a better job than what they just did. I really do. Now, they're both smarter than I am. They're both better communicators than I am, but I think we can do a better job just because I think we would break it down in a more manageable way. We would have a clear goal in mind, and there wasn't a real goal there. But hey, it was discussed recently, so I wanted you to hear it. All right, I'll stop right there. All right, I'll be back on the air hopefully here shortly. Everyone have a great day. God bless.